Hi everyone. Today's woman of the Bible is Sarah. We know a lot about Sarah, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper in it today and learn what we can learn from Sarah's life. Sarah's story starts in a very rich culture. She was used to riches a lot. She probably had a slave for everything, and she got married around the age of 15. And it was a couple years later when Abraham was called out of his country. He was studying into different things, and he began to hear God speak to him. And he followed God, which was totally unheard of in those times because it was a pagan culture. So when Sarah followed her husband out of her home, she was following him into something totally new. And everybody probably thought he was kind of crazy. So she was pretty amazing in following him that and not demanding that she stay at her father's house. One thing we know about Abraham and Sarah is that they had the same dads but different moms. So actually they were half brothers and sisters. And we'll think about that later on. So when she left this rich land, she was approximately 60 years old. And she left a very wealthy home for wilderness travel. So can you imagine the kind of culture shock she was in? It probably wasn't too easy. Another thing that she was going through is that she did not have children. And in those days, it was almost a must to give your husband an heir. And according to the law, the wife had about 2 years to give her husband an heir, and if she did not, then she could call in a slave to give him an heir. Well, we see that if she got married when she was approximately 15, and she was approximately 60 when they went out of Ur, that's quite a few years. She passed the 2-year mark. But Abraham was patient. We never read that he required her to give him the slave. We never read anything. And as long as she was in childbearing years, we see that Sarah kept hope. She kept hoping that she would have a child for him. And we'll learn later on that it wasn't until she was past childbearing years that she did something about it. So anyway, about 5 years after she left the home, they were wandering, and they ended up in the land of Egypt. And it's kind of amazing to understand that at 65 years old, Sarah was still beautiful. She must have been very, very beautiful, because Abraham was scared that the king would kill him so that he could take Sarah for his wife. So she must have been really beautiful. And we see that there it came in context. Abraham told her, he said, "You tell the king that you're my sister," which was the truth. She was his sister. And we find out that that really wasn't God's plan, but God did save her. You can read in Genesis 12, and also it happened again in Genesis 20. But God did save her, and everything works out okay. That the king did not take her. Actually, the king was scared to take her when he found out some things. So Sarah waited all these years from the age of 15 to at least we know 65, probably a little bit longer, and she didn't have any children, and she was realizing Abraham needs an heir. And so she gave him Hagar, and that's when her trouble began. She had been promised, God had came to her and promised her a child, but when you cannot have children anymore, what is your thought? You're like, well, this isn't going to work. God made a mistake somewhere. So she stepped in, and she says, maybe this is what God meant. And she gave him Hagar, and that's when all of her troubles began. When Hagar gave birth to her son Ishmael, then Hagar despised Sarah, and it was the beginning of trouble. And can you imagine, let's think of how Sarah felt. Every time she's seen this baby, every time she's seen Hagar, can you imagine the only thing she felt in her heart, in her mind, was her failure? She had failed to be who Abraham needed. And yet this lowly slave, gave him what he needed. Can you imagine how she always seen failure, and she always felt that slave's scorn and disrespect? Can you understand why she finally had enough of it and sent them away? I can understand Sarah. It's not right. but I can understand it. And then we know that even after that, it was what? She was 90, so it was another 30, 20 some years until she was rewarded with her promise. Can you imagine from the getting married around the age of 15 or something and waiting until you're 90, waiting for a child? Yeah. Would you have kept hope? I don't know if I would have. That would have been terribly hard, but she did. She kept hope for a lot of years, and it was unbelievable joy. And Isaac means laughter. The joy, the happiness when they finally had a son of their own. So some things I can learn from Sarah is, you know what? Sometimes we have to live with the consequences of our choices. You know, we can't get angry at God when the consequences are our own making. We need to learn to deal with them and move on. And realize we made a choice. It was our choice. We have to suffer the consequences, and we can make the best of it. Also, Sarah learned, and we can learn, that God can do the impossible. That situation in your life that looks awful, don't worry. God can do the impossible. He proved it to Sarah. Also, we need to remember that God's timing's not ours. He doesn't need any help from me and you. He can do it on His timing. And sometimes I get impatient, and it's hard for me to wait on God because I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait, 70 some years? I don't want to wait a lifetime. But we got to remember God will keep His promises no matter what the circumstances look like, no matter how long it takes. God's timing is not ours, and He will always keep His promise. We can count on it. We can take it to the bank. God will keep His promise no matter what the situation looks like. So if you're going through a hopeless situation right now and life just looks horrible, there is no hope in sight, that's when God can move. That's when God loves to move, is when the situation looks hopeless, because then you're not going to take credit that you did something. Everybody will know without a doubt that this was God. God can do the impossible. Don't forget that today. Love y'all.